A lot of different guys came in and booked for Eddie, but there was always the influence of Eddie Graham. And Eddie, in many people's circles, I've only spoken to Eddie on the phone, and I met him twice, I think, in my entire life. But he was always a gentleman. I mean, like he looked like somebody with beautiful bleach blonde hair, combed straight back, good looking guy. But he, to me, and every time I was ever around him, his presence was that of a gentleman and very smart. You will hear, many, many people throughout the years talk about the influence of Eddie Graham, not only on their own careers, but on the business, because his philosophies kind of just made their way all across the business. Whenever you would leave Florida, you would take a little piece of Eddie Graham's psychology and bring it into whatever it was that you were doing, wherever the hell it was, at the time. Kevin Sullivan. Kevin Sullivan is a guy that learned from Eddie Graham and that psychology. And then Kevin went with his own fucked up psychology that, man, it worked at the time. And I think Kevin has a different understanding of the business than a lot of people. And that's what you need. Because if everybody has the same philosophy and same outlook on the business, it means nothing. Because then it's all going to be the same. You need different takes. You need someone to be able to take Eddie's philosophies and Eddie's way of doing things and then make them your own. And I think that was what, Kevin Sullivan was able to do. You go up and you look into Georgia, and Georgia was a unique territory in that, based in Atlanta, it ran Macon and Columbus and just parts of Ohio and Chattanooga, and sometimes would venture into northern Florida, but not too often. And Georgia had ownership. There was ownership. Jim Barnett was an owner. Ole Anderson was an owner. The Briscoes were owners. Paul Jones, the promoter out of Columbus, I hope that's right. They all owned a portion of the Georgia booking territory. And Georgia always had bookers. And the bookers ran from Buck Robley to Bill Watts to Ole Anderson to Dusty Rhodes. Ran the whole gambit. So Georgia was a territory that, yes, they used bookers. They used guys that they would bring in, and they would help book. And it was their ideas that would then mold it. They would run it. Barnett would bless it. But for the most part, when Barnett brought a booker in, Gary Hart booked there. When Barnett brought a booker in, he let the booker do the wrestling side of things. Jim would give him advice, and Jim would tell him what he thought. And he would suggest things like, oh, God, Tommy Rich. But Tommy, Ole saw that. Ole saw this kid has got unbelievable charisma and, can do everything. And the audience is behind him, who gets the biggest reaction every night. In Atlanta was also the first television show to be on a superstation. So it went everywhere. It was the first. And now you're booking Georgia, but you're going everywhere. And so now booking offices around the country are like going, hey, can I get a date on that Tommy Rich? That Rod Piper, you got to do a color commentary. Could we get a date on him? Bob Armstrong, the Superstation made the Atlanta territory and Atlanta stars everywhere, nationally, long before anybody was promoting nationally. And it also gave them the balls, if you will. Well, let's go up into Ohio. Let's go on up and go places that we can, that make sense on our tours, to book and to run. So that's what they did. And it upset people like the Sheik. It upset people that were normally running those markets. And look, they didn't care. They had the power of TBS and they were able to go into Baltimore that was not a part of their territory. And bringing in the Carolinas, like with Jim Crockett, who had the Carolinas, and Jim Crockett had a lot of different bookers. That George Scott comes to mind. George Scott was I'd say a very vanilla worker. Great guy. I mean, God, I love George Scott to death, and think he was a really, really good guy. I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody that didn't like George Scott as a human being. But his booking was boring as shit. It just was boring. And the Carolinas had always relied on a lot of those old timers: George Scott, Johnny Weaver, Rip Hawk, Sweet Hansen. And the influx of the Ric Flair, now Ole Anderson and Wahoo, and younger stars that were different. They were just different. And the whole thing kind of worked together. Crockett would use people from Georgia. Georgia would use people from Crockett. Georgia would use people from Florida. Georgia would use people from Texas. Sent Gino there for a while. Sent my brother there for a little while. And they would use these talents to come in and get exposure. So while you're watching in Houston and you're watching TBS on cable, oh my God, Gino's on cable. He's in Atlanta. Holy shit. Makes him a bigger star. And when you talk about the bookers of Ole Anderson, who just passed, and Ole was a constant. And Ole was one of those guys who had a mind for the business, and he was a very straightforward, rough and rugged guy that ruled with an iron fist. But I think that when you think of Georgia and you think of Georgia Championship Wrestling and later World Championship Wrestling, the bookers that have come through there is kind of a who's who of the business. Dusty is a great name that came through there and booked and was very successful. But always in that mix was Ole Anderson, who stayed in until when WWF came in and they bought out the Briscoes, they bought out Paul Jones, they bought out Jim Barnett, and owned the majority of Georgia Championship Wrestling, which brought you to Black Saturday. Ole Anderson was the only guy that held out and said he had never worked for the WWF. Never did.
Pretty famous story there too, huh?
It absolutely it is, because it was something that happened, right underneath everybody. Ann Gunkel was, another one that was a part of that still had Ray's percentage in Georgia Championship Wrestling. So that in and of itself was unique. And then, as you go past Georgia and you get into Tennessee and look at, Tennessee was interesting from the standpoint of, there was the Memphis end, Memphis, Nashville, and they do Louisville and everything. And then you get down to Chattanooga and kind of the Chattanooga and Alabama and Pensacola and things like that, which would kind of be the continental base thing. But Tennessee was another one that was interesting. I think people give Jerry Jarrett a lot of credit, and Jerry deserves a lot of credit for owning it. And where I think Jerry Jarrett was best at was Jerry put Bill Dundee and Jerry Lawler in charge of his booking. And he also pit Lawler and Dundee against one another, figuratively and literally. He would pit them in programs against one another, but he also pit them against each other backstage. Jerry would have Lawler book and then tell Dundee how great Lawler's doing and send Dundee away. I don't need you right now. Then he'd get sick of Lawler. He'd bring Dundee back and get rid of Lawler. Lawler would go to wherever, Texas, or he'd go to Florida and have a stint there and then come back. But that's how Jerry played it. You know, other than Dundee and Lawler, I can't tell you any successful bookers that really booked the Memphis territory, if you will. And it was a different territory too. The guys lived there, and that's all they did. And on the east side, you had Goulas, and this is only my opinion. I thought that was just horrible cartoon. With George Goulas and Tojo Yamamoto, and just some of the guys that came out of there. It just wasn't the same. It was just hokey in comparison. And when you have seen everything else, I think when you compare every other territory that was very reality based and what have you, then you got to Memphis, and Memphis was the wild, wild west.